Welcome back, everyone. So now that we've actually built out our payment route, we need to write the code on our client site Stripe button component to make a request using the token we get back to that new route that we made so that our route can be actually tested to see whether or not it's making that Stripe call or not. Now, inside of our root folder, we're going to run yarn dev so that we can actually start both our backend server as well as our client application. Then what we're going to do is inside of our folder, we're going to cd into our client, and I'm going to have you add in a new library called Axios. Now, we're already very familiar with using fetch. The native fetch that we get from the web, i.e. the browser, is a fetch that is really useful when we need to make a quick request to an API for something. But it starts to get more cumbersome to use when we start to need to make more complex requests. And Axios is a library that's very popular amongst many front-end developers. So this is actually a really cool tool that I think is a great time for me to teach you, because there's a high likelihood that you'll come across a use case where the project you join is using Axios. And Axios actually makes it much easier for us to make post requests as well. So what you're going to do is just yarn add Axios inside of the client folder. Because as we now know, we have two separate projects with two separate different dependency libraries inside of their packages. So the client holds all of the dependencies and code for our front-end application, and our root folder holds all the code for our back-end application. So that's why you got to cd into the client and add Axios, because the Axios is a library we want to leverage on the front end. And once we've added Axios, what you can do is just go back to your code and navigate to your Stripe button component. Now, inside of the Stripe button component, the code that we're going to modify is this onToken function that we wrote. The onToken function is the function that we pass to this token property in our Stripe checkout, and it does something with the token object once we get it back from our Stripe checkout. Now, what we're going to do is we're actually going to make a request to our new payment route, passing in the token. Because as we know, this payment route is expecting the token, the ID, and the amount object. So using those two things is what we're going to pass using Axios. Now, in order to make this post request with Axios, we got to first bring it in. So we'll just import Axios from Axios. And then what we're going to do instead of this console log is we're going to say Axios. And Axios is a function that receives an object that has all of the actual properties that we want to pass in order for Axios to know what kind of request we're trying to make. And what it'll give us back is a promise. But first, with this object, we're going to say that the URL that we're trying to go to is payment. And Axios will automatically know that we're probably trying to make a request to our own /payment route, which is what we set up in our server.js. So it's going to use whatever URL we're currently at and then append /payment at the end of it and make this request to it. So that's why it's also really easy. We then pass a method property to let it know that it's a post method. And then the data represents the actual data we're trying to pass through. Now, the amount is going to go to the price for Stripe that we have declared here. And then the token is going to be the token. So we're passing through the token object as the token. And that pretty much is all our request is. It's just that URL, the method that it's going to be, and then the data we want to pass to it. And this now matches all of the things that we are expecting on our server rep. So now what we're going to do is we are going to actually check what kind of response we get back. So if it's successful, we know that from our payment route, we're going to send back a Stripe response. And then if it's an error, we're going to send back the Stripe error. So we're going to handle each case accordingly. Now, if it's successful, then what we want to do is we want to alert the user that the payment was successful. Now, what we want to do if it fails is we want to catch with an error. And then what we want to say is we just want to log out that there was some payment error. And this is more for us than for the actual user. Because if we're debugging, the user doesn't really need to know what kind of error we got, but it's easier for us to debug with this console log. And then what we do want to alert the actual user is that there was an issue with your payment. Please make sure you use the provided credit card. So the reason why we want to say this is because it's very likely the issue that they had was that they used a credit card that Stripe didn't recognize. So what we want to make sure they use is that test credit card we have inside of our checkout page. So this just reminds them or gives them a hint as to why there might have failed. Now, one thing to note, if you actually don't want to use Axios and you want to use the native fetch, it's very easy to do so. You just have to follow the configuration options that are available inside of the fetch documentation. I will link that specific part of the documentation inside of our resources, but I personally prefer to use Axios in most of my projects. So this is a good library, and the Axios documentation is also pretty easy to follow. I'm also going to link that in the resources as well if you're more curious about Axios. But passing through the actual data is the most important thing. We want to pass the amount, and we want to pass this token that we get back from the Stripe checkout. Now, inside of our server code, we are expecting that body to have the amount and the token, which is what we use to pass to our Stripe charge. I actually have a small little typo here that, in case you do as well, make sure that the error has a capital E. So just a quick thing to note, I actually just noticed that. But with that, we are now able to test whether or not our Stripe checkout now fully works and makes a charge. So let's go back to our application. And here inside of my checkout, I actually have a bunch of items. So now that I have all this stuff, let's try and pay it now. I'm just going to auto-complete this information. I am going to use that fake credit card that we have. And then I'm going to hit the pay now. And hopefully, as long as we don't get an error, we see that our payment was successful. And if we go to our dashboard, in fact, we see that we just got this new charge today. And inside of payments, we'll see that inside of our succeeded, this was the recent charge that was just made. Now, you'll notice that there was this other one. I actually made another charge earlier today, but just ignore this one. This is the successful one that was just made just now. So as we can see, all of our code is working. So that's really, really good because now we've actually completed the full Stripe payment process and charge process using some backend server, as well as rounded out what we need to do on our front end in order to fully complete this charge. So hopefully with this, everything made sense. If this was confusing, I know it was a lot of new backend stuff that we had to learn about how to write, but with this, more practice will definitely help. But really, at least from a high level, if you understand what it was that was happening that we were writing with the backend, that's really good as well. Because a lot of the backend code you might just sometimes have to read in order to understand how you interface with an API like this, as well as what it does when you're actually on a real full stack project. So now that we have a backend as well as a front end, we need to push up onto Heroku in order for Heroku to now serve our application with both our backend and our front end code. So let's do that in the next lesson.